Ladies and gentlemen, when you are at the bottom of the barrel, the only available path forward is up. But not if you're Bethesda. Because somehow they successfully managed to hit a new low with a self-contained DLC experience that is even more bafflingly boring than the vast and shallow Starfield. Shattered Space is a DLC that I genuinely held out hope for. I gaslit myself into believing Starfield was a product of stretching yourself too thin. And if Bethesda were to focus their development on one planet, then we'd get something truly good. Todd Howard managed to make it seem like this DLC would provide just what I hoped for by giving us a singular handcrafted sandbox experience, as opposed to dozens and even hundreds of procedurally generated nothing burgers, which would allow Bethesda to highlight their strongest trait: exploration. And Todd Howard even further amplified my hopes when he equivalated Shattered Space to Far Harbor, which is the only beacon of actual good content in the sea of slop that is Fallout 4. This equivalation is of course a lie. In reality, Shattered Space is $30 cut content that comes with the same terrible writing, same underwhelming exploration, and the same mediocre combat as the base game, while simultaneously also having less content, because ships are completely irrelevant in this DLC after landing on the planet once, which means there's no new ship parts or cool new Varun ships as a whole. Nor are there any worthwhile structures for outpost building. You'd think in a DLC centered around the Varun, you'd get some cool Varun architecture to play around with. But nope, you get two ugly hubs. There's also no new mechanics, so new weapons are just more of the same. In my original Starfield video, I made it clear that melee combat sucks in Starfield because every single melee weapon boils down to the same moveset, just with different damage numbers, making the option of armaments a mere option of skins. Now that option got a new addition, because the DLC's melee weapon has the exact same moveset as well. Thankfully, Bethesda finally addressed two things I brought up in my video, that being ammo crafting and melee weapon modding. I gotta give credit where credit is due. Figuring out something that was done decades ago in games like Fallout New Vegas must have been really hard for Bethesda, so thank you for bringing in ammo crafting. But I also have to give flack where they smoked crack. If you mod weapons, you typically see previews of how your weapon will look like if any changes are applied. This is a pretty standard expectation, all things considered. When you mod the DLC's melee weapon, you do get those previews. But if you mod any of the base game's melee weapons, there's not a single visual difference. It's all just arbitrary number modifications. The reason I'm leading the video with talks about melee modification of all things is because that level of laziness and half-ass implementations is a shining example of the quality you will get throughout the DLC. Let me paint you a picture. You land on a decent-looking planet that has the Las Vegas orb right in the center. Knowing Bethesda, you decide to put the story quest on the side for the time being and tackle side quests to have a better first impression of the DLC. And then, the first side quest you encounter is an egregious fetch quest that quite honestly might be the worst one in Bethesda's catalog. A scientist couple is baffled by poisonous plants appearing seemingly out of nowhere following the cataclysmic event that literally warped time and the laws of physics, so they employ you to grab samples for their research. Run around and fetch 3 tissues from dead animals. Then run around and fetch 3 tissues from plants. And then run around and fetch 4 seismic data logs. These 3 steps combined are not as horrendous as the final step that has you getting a single vial from a botanical complex. Said botanical complex is overrun by the Crimson Fleet. Now if you're like me and sided with the Crimson Fleet, then you'd probably assume that this step of the quest is going to be a breeze, as you can just walk peacefully past your homies. So you tell the quest giver, the Crimson Fleet are no problem for me. To which she says,
actually bro, they're different, they won't care for your allegiance.
At this moment, I was shook to the core for about 3 minutes. Have we really gotten to the point where Bethesda invalidate one of maybe like 2 choices you can make in the entirety of Starfield in favor of reusing enemies instead of coming up with something new or, you know, using something else? Every enemy faction in Starfield is Grunt with gun. So why did it have to be specifically Crimson Fleet Grunt with gun? To show me a note that has no narrative continuation? Visually, mechanically, and even in terms of voice lines, these are the exact same Crimson Fleet from the base game. If you gave these same exact set pieces to a competent studio, you'd know why there's a splinter group of Crimson Fleet. You'd have the option of interacting with them, albeit on disadvantageous terms. And you'd have a way to approach this mission in a manner that is more than just Starfield's boring combat. And at minimum, they'd be visually different enough for you to know you're dealing with something else, as opposed to witnessing Bethesda's laziness firsthand. If you want to thank anyone for such abysmal writing, you can thank Starfield's design director, Emil Pagliarulo, a delusional man who seems to think Starfield is a technical marvel and the best sci-fi RPG to ever grace Xbox, despite, you know, Mass Effect being a thing. Bethesda's astronomical downfall could be narrowed back to this one individual, and signs of his incompetence were apparent as far back as Fallout 3. You know, the game that needed a whole-ass DLC to fix the ending because of how horribly it was written? Yeah, that one.
Emil Pagliarulo, who is the lead designer and writer on Fallout 3, great writer.
The exploration in the so-called handcrafted world is no better than it is in base game Starfield. Instead of boring point of interest being generated at a random spot, now the equivalent boring point of interest is manually placed by Bethesda. The ones that have any merit are tied to quests. The ones that just exist in the vacuum of Varunkai are monotonous and quite frankly a waste of time. I stumbled across this slope shtick you're seeing right now in several different spots, and each time the reward was just some utterly useless material. Because of lazy shit like that, there is no reason to explore. And because there's no reason to explore, there's no incentive to not fast travel from quest marker to quest marker and experience the only thing Starfield is good at, which is loading screens. Though I will say, 2 additions that came in updates prior to the DLC's release are quite good and made this DLC bearable. Those additions are a detailed surface map that'll allow you to easily deduce what is procedurally generated slop. The other is a whip. Now you can traverse Varunkai in the vast nothing burger of Starfield in a whip that, surprisingly enough, is actually really cool. I like the design of this thing and I adore the fact that it has a jump. Though it does feel a bit wonky at times. But that's just the Bethesda charm, right? Out of all the points of interest present in this DLC, only one stood out to me, that being Mist Haze Cave. It gave me flashbacks of Elder Gleam Sanctuary from Skyrim. That little squirt of nostalgia gave me enough interest to proceed with the mystery of this cave, and it turned out to be quite engaging. The shtick is to collect 8 wooden geese left in various spots of the cave by some former Crimson Fleeter named Mrs. Goose. Why would you collect these geese? Because, why not, I guess. The setup and steps are there, but it seems like the revelation point to justify finding these 8 geese has not yet been discovered. If it even exists, that is. I wouldn't put it past Bethesda to consider finding 8 wooden geese as a reward within itself. One of the biggest mistakes this DLC makes is allowing you to keep your gear. It completely invalidates the charm of finding loot, because why would you ever care about a new damage stick when yours is pretty much best in slot? But it also makes combat a chore. None of the encounters with enemies were challenging or interesting. It all felt like a routine waste of my time. The new enemy types don't help either. It's just grunt with gun that can teleport, bug that can teleport, and melee guy. All of which come with the same dumb Bethesda AI. Taking away your gear at the start of the DLC wouldn't even be a problem. The Va'ruun are isolated and dismissive of outsiders. It wouldn't be far-fetched for them to disarm you until you prove your worth, at which point Bethesda could use the proving your worth period to meticulously design dungeons and encounters around the fact that they know you don't have ranged capabilities or protective gear against various environmental hazards. But maybe I'm giving Bethesda too much credit in my mind. It is very possible that they're not even capable of crafting intentional experiences anymore. Before we hop into the story, let's talk bugs. Shattered Space is a classic case of Bethesda bugginess. Right in the center of the city you'll be visiting for virtually every quest, there is an elevator that doesn't work. It's a bit strange, but not really a problem since there's another elevator beside it, albeit one that comes with a loading screen. The thing is though, the elevator does work. It's just someone at Bethesda placed the button prompts underneath the elevator, so when it's on the second floor, you can send it down from the first floor, but past that, there's nothing else you can do. All around, that's very minor and doesn't ruin the experience much, but this next one pissed me off. There is a quest in which you reach a certain camp and have to look for clues to trigger the next quest step. I found the first, the second, and then I hit a wall. I, for the life of me, couldn't find this next clue to finally be done with this boring spot. I started second guessing my intellect and thought I had been stumped by a Bethesda quest of all things. Turns out that, nope, the last clue was just invisible. Does Bethesda even do quality assurance? Like, seriously, this is part of the main quest line.
This whole thing fucking sucks. I mean, this is the biggest pile of shit.
Now it is time for arguably the worst part of this DLC, the story. Bethesda had an incredible amount of potential with the story of Shattered Space. The Va'ruun are the only interesting faction in the base game, despite them having a very minimal amount of screen time. The Va'ruun embassy mission, where you're walking through bizarre serpentine architecture with a hallucinogenic plant augmenting your perception, is easily the most creative shit base game Starfield has to offer. And unfortunately, it is also the most creative shit that the Va'ruun faction has to offer as a whole, because Bethesda at no point play into the bizarre nature of the Va'ruun in this DLC. They feel like the same boring Atlantis mob of the base game, just with tattoos and goofy accents, as opposed to a refined, hyper-religious society. It all starts with exploring an abandoned space station consumed by blue goop and blue phantoms that come to be due to an experiment gone wrong. After stabilizing the systems, you use the space station to warp to Va'ruunkai's orbit, where you send a distress signal and are prompted to land on the planet of the Va'ruun. Initially, they're not happy to see an outsider, but then the phantom of their speaker, Anasko Va'ruun, appears. They can only see him, but you, oh great chosen one, you can hear him. And upon learning this, you go from being a mere outsider to the great chosen one, the Vindicator.
Vindicator.
From here, you're forced to join the Va'ruun and help each of the houses until a big machine is built to penetrate through the Las Vegas orb and save Anasko Va'ruun. Some of the missions here are decent and give insight into the Zealots and their former house, known as House Malin, though it's mostly offshoot mentions and remarks. There's no real depth to explore in regards to any of the houses or the relationships each has with the Zealots. Which is a great shame, because the amount of potential here for something substantial is immaculate. Like, Bethesda literally had the opportunity to make a few questlines in which you get each of the houses to agree to reinstate the Va'ruun Zealots back into House Malin, and with that, maybe see some drastic difference in the settled systems or the DLC's city. Eventually, you reach Anasco Va'ruun, and you are given an illusion of choice. Do you turn off the life support of the Phantoms here, or do you send them to wage a crusade against the settled systems? Regardless of what you choose, the settled systems will be no different. Following this, the Zealots breach the Citadel and you make your way up to where Anasco Va'ruun gives you another illusion of choice. Do you submit to the Great Serpent and reset the device so that the Phantoms may actually wage war in settled systems? If you do, then you get on your knees, you see a loading screen, and you're loaded back to your last save state.
What the fuck?
Meaning, the only option you have is to attack Anasco and destroy the device, pretty much ending this whole ordeal. I genuinely don't understand. Why would you even implement a choice at that point if you're going to reload me to my last save state? Like, this is literally the same abysmal trash that plagued Fallout 3's ending. The audacity Bethesda has to market this slop as an RPG experience is truly astonishing. After all of this is done, you wake up with the council members of each of the houses asking you about Anasco. You say he went cuckoo bananas, and then you get to decide the future of House Va'ruun at large. Do they remain isolated in peace, or do they wage war on the settled systems? Spoiler alert, nothing will change about the settled systems. Shafted Space is a very on-rails, inconsequential, and typical modern Bethesda experience, also known as garbage. And worse yet, this garbage costs $30 for a measly 6 hours. Think about it this way. For full price Starfield, you got the Crimson Fleet, United Colonies, Free Rangers, and Ryujin faction questlines. And here, for what is essentially half of Starfield's price, you're getting the equivalent of one of those faction questlines just with a Va'ruun skin. It's disgraceful, it's disgusting, and ultimately, it's deserving of a
I'm in the thick of it, everybody.
out of 10. That's about it. Don't forget to slap like, slap wife, hit Skarub, and I shall catch you next time. Bye.